Well, welcome everyone. Hope you've had a wonderful conference. Just a sort of backstory here. David was one of the first people to actually agree to pay a plane ticket for me to go to a conference. So I'm sort of forever indebted for him and his support of my work. And so I'm always happy to participate in his events. And that was Agile Ireland. And I'm so excited to see him sort of evolve this into the product space because I know his heart was there too from when I first started speaking with him. So I am incredibly excited to be speaking with you today. I always love questions. Feel free to email me anytime. I do spend a fair amount of time on Twitter, it seems. So you could reach me there too, is not a bad place to go. I think also, so the organizers and Allison will try to share this link, like if there's a chat or somewhere, we're going to share this link to the Miro board if it's more convenient or effective for you to follow along in Miro. I've made this board accessible, and you can also look at it afterwards to see if any of these frameworks are interesting. So feel free to follow up there if you need to. Very, very brief background about me. I have a background in product management and UX. I work at a company called Amplitude. My role there puts me in touch with a lot of teams from around the world doing coaching and doing workshops. You know, we have a great product, but we also do other things to help teams be successful. Our product is in the product analytics space. Yeah, and I love UX and love product, and happy to jump into the talk today. So one thing I wanted to create a caveat here. The title of this talk is Asking Better Questions Together. And obviously questions are super valuable in all aspects of our work and life. You know, we can ask questions related to continuous improvement, maybe with our team, or we might want to ask ourselves questions about why the heck we're working at one company or not. There's a lot of good reasons to be asking questions. Specifically for the purpose of this talk, we're focusing on questions that focus our research efforts or discovery efforts, maybe how we design experiments, the experiments we actually run, the measurement of those experiments, analysis, and various other things. So, questions is a huge topic, and we ask all sorts of powerful questions in management and work and life. But today we're focusing on the questions that make our research better and discovery better, experiments better, etc. So the inspiration for this particular talk is, as part of my role at Amplitude, Amplitude does product analytics, and surprisingly, we're really good at measuring things, but one of the hardest skills is to develop good analytical questions. And we do a number of workshops that are centered around just helping people think more laterally, kind of think more holistically about question asking to guide their research and measurement. And by questions, I don't mean specifically, how many people accessed the site yesterday. That's certainly one type of question, but we cast a really big net to get people thinking about strategy and all kinds of things. So this is the result of doing a workshop, maybe 30, 40 times now at the moment with companies, as big as, FedEx, IKEA, down to 2 people working on a startup together. So this is the result of that work. And I'm actually going to share some anonymized real world examples as we go through to give you a sense of how some of these techniques work. So before we really dig into solutions, because this is a product talk, right? So we should start kind of with the problem, or at least the opportunity. One of the biggest challenges here is that product managers are heavily incentivized to have answers. And you would think that product managers are amazing at questions, and we do ask ourselves a lot of questions, but when it comes often to verbalizing those questions, in many of our environments, we're expected to have the answers. What happened yesterday? Well, we're supposed to answer it. Or what are you going to do next year? We're going to answer that. What's your strategy? We're going to answer that. And in fact, we're so programmed to have answers. I've noticed that some product managers, and even myself, I would fall into the trap where I stopped asking myself good questions, and I certainly didn't support my team in bubbling up the most powerful questions that you could ask. Now, I put a couple footnotes to this. You notice the exception to the rule here when if you can 100% guarantee me that this question will inspire brilliant thinking around everyone, usually people are like, oh, ask those questions. Those are fine. But unfortunately, it's very hard to absolutely guarantee that your question will be brilliant. The second footnote is researchers and analysts love answering questions. And so they want you to bring them questions. So some people actually are professional question answerers, but note that even they can benefit from figuring out how to help you reframe your question. And the third footnote is unless you are repeating the brilliant question that the leader asked the other day. So that's always a good tip. If you want to ask a powerful question, just remember what the VP of product asked everyone a couple days ago and said, I'm curious, and repeat that question. And that's always pretty safe and effective. But you get the idea. Product managers are incentivized to have answers, and we sometimes lose our question asking muscle, and that's extremely important. Now, how do things go wrong? How, questions can be super powerful, right? They can be a catalyst to drive the team to diverge in the right ways and then help the team converge in the right ways. So powerful questions are incredibly important, but often the team encounters some patterns that aren't so effective. And I'll draw them out in this Miro board. So some teams just skip divergence altogether and jump straight to just the pointy tip of convergence, right? Just don't even worry about divergent questions. They get right away to converge and to get everyone to agree on something at the end. Do you agree? Do we all agree on this? When you hear that in a meeting, well, what are you supposed to say at that point? It's an interesting one. Now, the next thing that some teams do is that they only diverge. And this creates what I would call almost like turbulence up in the air, right? So they diverge and they just keep diverging and they just let those things simmer on the teams. And there's never any reframing of the question. They just kind of sit there like elephants in the room, right? They just sit there floating over the team. Now, some teams, it's not quite as extreme. They just don't diverge as much or converge as much. And so, you just sort of, the diamond kind of goes like this, right? So in those cases, some teams do that. But you can sort of see the problem here is that when we're limited in terms of how we pose questions and refine our questions, it can have sort of a really big impact, ranging from premature convergence, so driving us down super quickly to a particular decision before having a chance to reframe and think about the bigger picture, or endless divergence, and then you're up there. So those are some anti-patterns that tend to happen with questions that we want to be sure to avoid. Now, why do those things happen? Why do we get into those particular cycles? Asynchronous communication is really popular these days. And I just got one of these this morning from a coworker, like, hey, it'd be cool to get your eyes on this. And it wasn't like, because I'm doing this, or because I'm trying to do this, or this type of feedback would be helpful, or questions like this would be helpful, or this is not helpful, or this is in draft form, or this has been sold to the whole sales team. So John, you better agree with this or else. It was just like getting your eyes on this. So okay, comment in the doc has become pretty popular, and that doesn't necessarily bring up the best questions. What else impacts the quality of questions? Has anyone, I doubt this hasn't happened to anyone, that you're at minute 56 of an important meeting and then someone says, well, does anyone have any questions? And meanwhile, you just want to get some water and go to the bathroom so you can get to the next meeting in 4 minutes. The last thing on your mind is, I'm going to start to iterate on a great question. If in general, someone asks at the end of those meetings, like, when are we going to meet next on this? That's like the equivalent of question you get at the end. Now, the flip side of that is the, carefully crafted design team activity to surface all kinds of questions. And you literally have this massive, well, we don't do, walls. I guess if you're back in person for working, you got this massive mural board or physical wall of stickies, and someone says, like, we're out of time. What a great activity. What a great activity. Those are some great questions. That really got everyone thinking, but you never revisit it again, right? And actually, I'm having a lot of funny thoughts about this, but I just spoke with someone that just returned to their office, and they sent me a message because they previewed this talk, and they said, well, I walked back in the office after 2 years and the same thing was on the wall that we had spoken about, and we had never revisited it anyway. So it might as well have just sat there during the pandemic. It's just rotting on the wall. The stickies might have just fallen off by that point. So these are all kind of anti-patterns that come up, poorly guided kind of requests for feedback, rushing the question asking, kind of doing a great activity, getting everyone's sort of deep, dark assumptions of the company out, and then just letting it float there with no follow-up or no action item. And, that got us thinking. Well, that's good that it got people thinking, but at the same time, that doesn't help when people are still thinking about those problematic things months later, right? So these are some anti-patterns that kind of creep up on teams. When question asking is working really, really well, it's like a dance of people. So it starts with a nonsensical question, and that leads to a slightly better question. And then someone else reframes it, and then that gets someone thinking, and she's going to go off and be thinking about this for a while and spin her wheels on this a couple days later. But meanwhile, another team member has an adjacent question, and another member is refining it. And then, of course, you get to that point where someone has the realization, wait, we're at the complete wrong level. And this kicks it back, and they go back into this thing. This is what it looks like when it's effective. The important point, though, that I'm trying to make here is that if you don't create an environment where this dance can happen at different time scales and with different collaboration patterns, if you don't make it safe to get through the activity and then have this person say, wait, we need to go up a level, then you're going to be in trouble. So I woke up at 5:30 my time today and did a 2.5-hour workshop with like a major company in Europe. And literally at minute 2 hours and 28 minutes, someone dropped the knowledge bomb right at the end that it occurred to them that their framing of their user was actually limiting them, and they had to rethink it. So when anything gets in the way of this sort of free flow of question framing and refinement, you have problems. So into using Miro lately for talks. I know my eye contact probably struggles here, but hopefully this will work. Another way I thought of explaining what this looks like is you could imagine, the typical, consulting 2x2 with certainty and uncertainty on the x-axis and high value and low value on the y-axis. So high value certainty are the things that's our unique knowledge about the customers and market. We've discovered new experiments. We've learned things through trial and error. We know things that most people don't know, but you know them. So that's valuable. Now, uncertainty and questions that sort of float a little bit and get people thinking are also potentially valuable, right? So high value uncertainty looks like, wow, this is a signal of an opportunity. I'm not quite sure where it's going, but this is looking positive. Or things most people think they know, but we know we don't know. So in fact, acknowledging that you don't know the answers to questions could be one of the most valuable things you have as a company, whereas your competitors think they know the answers to the question. Because if you know you don't know the answer to the question, you're going to operate differently from someone who thinks they know the answer to the question. Those things signal learning is required. They start with things like, I just don't know, right? And this goes back to that product manager problem. Product managers are not supposed to say, I don't know. That's like, bring me problems, not solutions, right? At best, it's sort of like, I don't know, but I'll have the answer for you in an hour or two, right? Like even that's kind of rushed. The anti-patterns as it relates to questions, though, is that we sit down here in this low value area. So you can have low value uncertainty, which is where, we have these unanswered questions that persist. You have eroded shared understanding, lacks vision or context. I call it like chaos induced amnesia. We just have a pileup of unanswered uncertainty, and it's dragging our team down. And then one of the interesting things of questions is, if the person who knows the answer to the question has left the company, you might as well not have the question, right? You'll have to re-ask that question for someone to figure out. Low value certainty looks like things like most estimation, prescriptive roadmaps, stuff everyone knows, success theater. So what you notice when you're talking to teams is that often they sort of keep it really safe down here in low value certainty. They keep it maybe, and that sort of drifts over into this low value uncertainty as all the understanding erodes, and they're not able to kick it up into these higher value areas where either you admit you don't know that, but you admit that that's a great opportunity, and then you shift it over to high value certainty, or you have high value certainty that's sort of you're running your business on, and that's really important. So that's another reason, it seems a little abstract and related to questions, but what we're getting at here is, when we can't ask good questions, we tend down to this area right here. And when we ask good questions, we tend to like drift up. This is what we want. We want to go up higher here on this particular chart. Finally, I kind of mentioned this elephant in the room thing. I don't know why I ever drew this called the room and the elephant. I think it was just to play around with this idea. But, one of the hardest things related to question asking is that you get these existential elephant in the room questions that become so ingrained in people's psyche and their positivity or lack thereof, or they persistently impact psychological safety. And it's either questions that no one has said out loud or could or felt safe to say out loud, or it's questions that get persistently asked, like, are we going for the enterprise or not? And that just sort of simmers over time for a long period of time. So I wanted to end on that sort of anti-pattern related to questions thing. And, broadly what I'm saying is the setup for this, go back and give us a quick summary, is that we often kind of jump over divergence or convergence. That's problematic. We don't set up our activities to really get the best questions. When we can't get a great exchange of behaviors, we sort of lose this dance and lose this sort of unique thing that's happening. We tend to not really sit with uncertainty for a while. And finally, we kind of let these elephant in the room questions simmer, or we don't ask the questions that matter. So what I'm going to try to show you today are some techniques that we use to address these challenges, and hopefully that you can use in your particular organizations. So one of my biggest realizations over the last year in doing these workshops was actually that before you think about questions, it's important to embrace why you're trying to answer the question. And my key realization is that really, really skilled product managers, for example, are able to almost dance between these hats of uncertainty, right? Or the why we're asking questions super easily. They jump from decisions to assumptions to understanding performance and progress to model making, and they do that very seamlessly. But other people get stuck in one particular place, so there is always an executive who is it working? Is it working? I'm so curious about how blank is working. Is it working? We need to figure out how to gauge our progress. There's someone wearing that performance and progress hat. Similarly, there's some people who are very, very deeply into the kind of assumptions hypothesis testing. Everything for them is an assumption that they need to prove or disprove before they can move forward. Some people are very much in the decision frame. Like they're treating this little product as a little bit, not as much as a science, but more of a game. Like I'm a poker player, I'm a gambler. We have to kind of weigh uncertainty and make the best decision we can given the available information. And some people are, I fall into this trap of kind of model makers, right? They are just always sitting trying to understand like the perfect series of things around causality or correlation and predict things in the business. I got heavily into something that called the North Star framework because of this, because I'm really into model building. And so that's I have a dominant hat here, which is I'm probably kind of deep myself in model making and decision making. Those are sort of my particular deep areas. But the interesting thing, and if you're able to access the Miro board, we could share the link again if that's possible, is I actually included some prompts here to get people thinking about these. But in our activities, what we first do before we brainstorm questions is that we think about the decisions we're trying to make, the assumptions that we have, the areas of performance and progress that we're thinking about, and any relevant models that we might be working with. And that becomes a catalyst for people to almost center and guide their question asking. And it really helps the team commit to the why of the question asking versus a situation where people are like, does anyone have any questions? Or, what's on people's mind? Those are powerful framing. It's important to ask people what's on people's mind occasionally, but you have more of a risk at that point of sort of floating these questions out there and never reaching any kind of next step or conclusion for those. So the first kind of model to think about is that there are sort of 4 general hats that I've observed, at least when it comes to why people are asking the questions. This is minus, of course, the sort of human condition type reasons, right? I'm scared. I don't know whether I should work here anymore. I feel an existential crisis with my company. There's obviously, a whole realm of things floating around in each of these people's heads. Why do I need to make a decision, or why do I need to test my assumption? So we're not including all of those. But from sort of a functional standpoint, these tend to be the reasons people are even curious or even posing questions. So we have our 4 hats of thinking about uncertainty. Next, you have a general idea of kind of the level that you're focusing. So one of the major issues when people are posing questions is that they're mismatching their question resolution or question area with where the actual thing is. And so I'm sure you all know exactly this particular situation where you're in a room, someone's like, does someone have any questions? And one person is like, well, should the button pixel radius be 3 or 5? And the next person is like, why are we trying to do business in China at the moment? In the same meeting, right? So one thing that we've realized in our particular workshops and working on this is that the level that you're thinking is important. Extremely important, though, is that moving up and down these levels are part of that kind of divergent, convergent motion that it comes to creating good questions. And let me give you an example from the real world. We'll revisit this example later, actually, because it's kind of fun. So we were doing an exercise and a team says, we're stuck right now on whether we should do a platform strategy or sell, an individual module strategy. This is a very common thing in B2B. And they're sitting there and I posed the question to them. It's like, what decisions would that help you make? And then an engineer said, oh, well, I'm running a bet right now and we have to think about UX and should we try to design in cross-module usage? Should we consider persona Y? That's my realm of the decision. So product leader was like, should we pursue a platform strategy or individual modules, right? Meanwhile, there was another person in the room that was like, I thought we had already decided to improve the modules. Do we do X or Y to improve the module? If we have a little bit more of a platform strategy, we might do X, and if we don't, we might do Y. But here's the kicker, is that we're going down this particular activity. So you can see what's happening, right? We start here, we loop all the way down here. Some people are coming from this direction. They're moving up. We have to bring them in both directions. And then someone drops the knowledge bomb right in the middle of the workshop. Hey, everyone, we think this is a decision about whether to do a platform strategy or do individual modules, but this is fundamentally a question of who we serve as a company. Do we serve the, I don't know, an example, like, do we serve the employee or do we serve their manager? That's the question, because if we serve the employee, we might do X, and if we do the manager, we might do Y. So right at the end of this, someone drops the knowledge bomb, jumps up to business strategy. And this is the motion that you see happen in these question storming or question asking activities. So second model for you to think about is that not over constraining. So again, think about divergence and convergence. If we just immediately said, okay, everyone, in this meeting, we are only talking about whether to do cross-module usage. Please brainstorm your questions about cross-module usage. If you do that, and if you constrain that too early, you might lose a valuable opportunity to figure out that this is actually a high-level business strategy question. The reverse is true, that if you don't want to go crazy, if you've already decided all this stuff and it's been communicated in the company, ideally, maybe you want to focus in on bets and experiments, because you don't want to necessarily like pull back up all that decision-making thing. This is where it's really helpful to have decision-making logs, by the way. So, model number one was that we tend to have people who are seeking, to reduce uncertainty for different reasons, to improve their decisions, reduce uncertainty about assumptions, improve their performance, know performance so they can do other things. Model number two is basically an idea of resolution, like where are we operating? Cool. Next, we have to think about what types of questions should we be eliciting? Where are we? Now, I'm going to give you the clearest example here. Definitional questions. We were doing a workshop and someone, they get deep into it and they get to this question. It's like, we've been talking about cross-platform, but we haven't defined it. And another person said, yeah, we've been talking about usability, but no one's defined usability. And then another person said, and actually we were talking about MVP and no one's defined what an MVP is. Whoops. Okay. Definitional questions are important. Now, often what you see, so descriptive questions answers what's going on, where, with whom. So it's literally like, is this cohort of customers doing, what is literally going on? What is happening? How much, how many, when? Now, descriptive questions are really valuable, but often people sort of jump to conclusions. They say, well, we need to know how good this is. And meanwhile, someone else is saying, we haven't even described what's happening yet. And you're jumping already to like evaluative questions. Let's move on up. Evaluative questions answer how useful it is. Is it working over what time period? How well? For whom? So that's like, is the workflow performing better than before? Is it more useful than before? Now, if we started immediately with an evaluative question before getting our definitions and descriptions straight, we might be skipping a step. We need to kind of think about these things. I'm not suggesting that all these things need to go in order, but you understand there's different types of questions. Contextual. I'll give you an example. In most B2B environments, there's a complex relationships of employees with each other, and people think their product is like 90% of the picture, when actually your product is 3% of your customer's world in a standard enterprise or B2B setting. So what else is going on? What are the incentives in the company? What's the context? What's the surrounding environment around their using your product? What other products are they using? What's context is relevant? What are we doing? Then we keep moving through different types of questions. So explanatory explains what's happening. It starts to get causal at this point, right? Like, what's going on? Why is it happening? What made this happen? Now, again, if you jump straight to explanatory questions, or you only do explanatory questions, you might be missing out on other options. And then this is where it gets really interesting, is that often people go into meetings and they basically ask for some descriptive questions or some evaluative questions, and that's it. They never ask definitional questions. They never ask contextual questions. Maybe they just look for some sort of cheap causation, maybe, but they're totally missing out on exploratory questions. What questions should we even be asking? So imagine a question that is meant to just get other questions. It could be as simple as that. What questions should we even be asking is a really good question. And then you get to strategic questions and generative questions. Generative questions think about possible futures or what are our options, what should exist. Strategic thinks about implications beyond just causality. So you go to a team and they say, we have determined that sharing the post 3 times makes it 90% more likely for the person to be with us a year later. That's causal, maybe. Maybe they tested that. Maybe it's a causal relationship, but it's missing a complete sense of strategy. What are the implications that why should it do we want to have people addicted to our social media platform? Right? So that's actually an important question, a generative question, or what are our options? How might we also pursue that? So what you find, hopefully this model is useful for you as well. But as you think about the types of questions that you're asking, they often sort of follow a little bit of the sort of diamond in the double diamond, right? Where some questions open up the room, like generative questions, contextual questions, descriptive questions open up the room. And then there's other questions that like you start evaluative questions, right? You start thinking like, is it working? Is it doing that? And obviously this forms a loop, right? So the double diamond never ends there. It's more like a loop curls around to this and generates more information to do it. So that model is very interesting. So we need to be thinking about the questions we should be eliciting. So to summary, we've got to think about why we're asking the questions. We've got to think about at what level are we actually focusing our questions. And then we have to think about what types of questions are we asking. So let me show you this in a simplified example first. In this particular example, I'll just keep this really simple. Some developers wondering, should we use the dash notation system for sub work orders in a work order system? And then the opportunity level, someone's thinking about, what do we need to do to make grouping work orders easier? On the product strategy level, should we even be focusing on maintenance accounting? Is this kind of the thing we should be doing? And at the highest level of the company, should we branch out to a multi-sided marketplace for vendor ecosystem? So what starts as a very mundane question about the numbering system actually has implications. And so if you were doing an activity and you were stuck down here on numbering system and you hadn't considered these questions or create an environment where they could emerge, that would be problematic. Let me give you some other examples. This is anonymized here, but this is a classic problem. When and how should we sunset the desktop apps? This is the format we actually use in our workshops. When and how should we sunset the desktop apps? One assumption is that there should be feature parity. What percentage of customers are not using the desktop apps? Now we're down here in the performance zone. What models are at play? Well, there's the relationship between returning to the product and value retention as a customer. So that's a model that someone's building. From there, we were able to demonstrate, ask the questions. So I just want to point out 2 things. Definition, slow rollout. Definition, sunset. Definition, success. Definition, target users. Desktop only. So before they could even get started, they had to define some terms. And then as you go through the particular activity, descriptive things, how are the feature qualities of the desktop app that are not present in the web app? You can sort of see a pattern here. And this starts to get to explanatory questions. Why are so many people still only using the desktop app? That's a really interesting question. And then it finally gets here. You could go back to the Miro board if you want to see all the questions, but generative questions like, is there a future where we still even offer desktop apps? Should we keep a way to re-allow users to so these are, will the future and for the future end users' lives live in multiple platforms? So these are very generative high-level questions. So that's one sort of format and flow for this when you're thinking. Now, this is another example just focusing on that kind of double diamond approach. This is a news team thinking about should they invest in the redesign of their homepage. Right off the bat, what is the purpose of a homepage? Other questions, what's going to happen if we even removed the homepage? Next, is the homepage a legacy concept from newspaper days? So you can see that they really kept alive this divergence as they were moving across this span of questions. Then, this is the classic question. What does success like? How do we define success? When is the redesign done? Those are very evaluative questions, but they're in the right spot of this particular diamond. You'll note here that it took a lot of prompting for this team. I had to remind them of all the W's, like who, what, where, when, why, where, which is, how, have many, the W's and H's. Encourage them to do playful, curious, fun, and fanciful question asking. Explain what powerful questions are, like those questions like, why do homepages even exist? It's kind of a brilliant question. And then highly analytical questions like, for population, what is the effect of intervention on outcome compared to control within time? Sometimes a team wants those types of questions. And so it's important to coax them into thinking about that. I'll give you one more format, as you can see, about pulling these ideas together. These are basically taking the concepts we had before and iterating on them and bringing together these particular models. So back to platform versus best in class. This is the moment when they realize, who the heck are we building for? Over here, you have very sort of bet-oriented questions. How can we work with module teams specific to the domain problem, sustain it? How should all the parts be structured? The interesting one here, which was very, kind of the big aha moment for this team, is they realized that the sales team loved selling modules because it helped them reach their quota, but the investors were being sold a platform. Very classic thing if you're in the startup world. You sell the investors the platform, but sales is out there selling, like your individual modules. So this is the moment when it opened it up for the team, that they realized this is not about platform versus module. This is about finances. This is about investment. This is about sales. This is a very important point for this particular workshop. Cool. So I'll throw, we'll close up just a couple minutes. I know that we're, at the end of the day, message is coming soon. So I'll leave you with a couple thoughts to finish on. Is that often people think you need to agree on everything. And so when it comes to prioritizing, this section is on prioritization. When it comes to prioritizing which questions to answer, here are some important things to think about. Some things are important that you all agree. Some things you actually benefit from healthy tension and disagreement. So everyone thinks, well, we need to answer all the questions. Well, that's not true. In fact, you might benefit from not answering certain questions. The trick is, in this particular model, is making that visible. The biggest problem on the team member is your team members wondering, like, why do the leaders of this company not answer that question? It's having a terrible effect on everyone. And then meanwhile, the leaders have been like, actually, I think we benefit from healthy disagreement, right? You get to those problems. So what tends to happen is you might benefit from healthy disagreement, but then there are moments when you're not sure you benefit from full agreement anymore. That is a really good time to start surfacing powerful questions. And then at that point, once it gets down into this area, you have to learn and reduce uncertainty. So this model might be helpful. It's a range basically thinking about whether there's divergence or convergence over the agreement and whether you should maintain it or disrupt it. So you might consider using a model like that when thinking about what questions to prioritize. The final thing as we wrap up is that one of the biggest challenges to this is that, again, there's just not a vocabulary around assumptions or things. So there's a huge difference between assumptions that you are agreeing as a team to test, and then assumptions that are considered operating assumptions that you put an expiration date on, and in 3 months you revisit them. Huge problem when thinking about brainstorming questions and helping people inspire better questions and prioritize their questions. Half the room thinks that they're in the meeting to figure out which questions they're going to research, and half the room is sitting there saying, yeah, no, we're going to table that one, right? And this kind of boils down to these, type 1 decisions that need to be made right away versus type 2 decisions that can be delayed. So that's another thing to think about as you're thinking about how to prioritize questions. Another thing to think about when prioritizing questions is that in many cases, it's better to marginally reduce uncertainty about something that's high value than it is to get perfect certainty around something that's low value. So what happens with a lot of teams is that they say, well, we can't answer that question, so we're going to focus on these other questions in our research. And meanwhile, even if you answered the research 100% perfectly, it wouldn't really project you along. So another thing when prioritizing or helping the team focus is, are you leaving room for the high value, low certainty areas where even just a marginal increase in certainty is going to help you forward? Before we wrap up, the main thing is to answer the question. So once we do this a lot with our customers in Amplitude. It's like, once you've figured out a decision, an assumption, and brainstormed a set of questions, think about this as your learning backlog, right? You're moving some items over to researching. And as you've got more data about them, you're sharing finding for the teams. This addresses the problem where you go into the meeting and people come up with 100 great questions and the leader says, great questions, everyone. And there's no follow-up, right? So how do you create the follow-up once you've brainstormed these questions and thought about prioritizing them, thought about what your high value uncertainty that you need to reduce? Are you following through on that method? What tends to happen is a UX researcher will say, I've been meaning to do this research method for the last quarter. I want to do that method, instead of agreeing that it's a question that the team wants to answer. So to wrap up, thinking about the tips for making this work and sort of tying up this particular talk, to be successful in the create environments where people can ask better questions together, you need to give people opportunities to diverge and kind of float around and do that dance. 2, humans are not brainstorming robots. So there's some percentage of your team. Some PMs love to sit in a room and just generate stickies all day if someone just told them to, right? Or designers. Some people work differently. They don't want to be put on the spot. They need the ability to participate async. So you need to leave those opportunities. You need to leave room to ask the dumb questions and kind of play that question framing game. Next, just as we think about product work, you need to leave room to iterate and refine on the questions. If you just leave 5 minutes, I guarantee you do not have the best framed question, and I guarantee you have not gone up and down the stack that I described to think about good questions. Finally, definitions are surprisingly, crazily important into thinking about how people can ask better questions. Wait to rank and prioritize your questions. As I mentioned, you could be there and you could be brainstorming for 1 hour and 50 minutes, and then someone will just throw it into a whole new level and a whole new way of understanding, and you want to make room for that. And so finally, think about the why over the way, right? You're answering these questions to inform decisions, reduce uncertainty about assumptions, help understand progress or making a model. And that tends to kind of depersonalize. So I spoke to a leader the other day of a really popular SaaS company, B2B SaaS company, and they said, I'm being driven crazy by the team. The team keeps coming asking me the same question over and over again. I said, well, why are they asking that question? They don't tell me. They just assume that I know. They keep asking me, like, how quickly are we going to go up into the enterprise? So imagine that a developer or designer or product manager went to that leader and said, I kind of need to know the time frame that we're going to go up into the enterprise, because I'm trying to weigh this decision, whether to go in this direction or that direction, which is going to impact these other decisions. And we have these various questions about it. So even if you could give me, is it going to be a 5-year thing or a 1-year thing? That would actually help kickstart our effort. That's focusing on the why of the question, not the particular way to do that. And so thanks. Hopefully this has been interesting, kind of an insight into someone doing, dozens of workshops all the time around asking better questions. You're welcome to access this Miro board, or I could even PDF it afterwards and make it available for people. And if you have any questions, feel free to send them my way. And hopefully that was interesting. I will stop sharing now.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, John. So we'll have time for a couple of questions, folks. A couple of things, John. I really like the focus on the why, not the way.
Yep.
And I really like the example you shared around that kind of team diverging and what the purpose of the homepage was. I thought that was super,
Yeah.
super interesting, super surprising, but in some ways maybe not surprising as well.
Yep.
Okay, so we do have some questions coming in. So again, folks, please add them in the Q&A panel of Hopin. So we'll start with Sergey's question. What can we do to help people feel safer with leaving questions unanswered?
I think this is around the expiration date. This is where this is the biggest challenge I see in that area with, well, first of all, to make it feel safer leaving it questions unanswered, first break it down. Figure out the decisions, figure out the related assumptions. Is it safe to leave it unanswered? So sometimes you'll get 3 people in the room. Someone will think it's safe, someone thinks it doesn't safe. But in person number 1's mental model, it really impacts no decisions. And in person 3's mental model, it impacts every decision-based business. So number 1, focus on the why, why of that question, right? Be verbal with each other, talk to each other about those things. The second thing is the idea of the expiration date. Like, assume that you want to operate under the assumption that something is true. Be extremely explicit. We will operate under the assumption that the enterprise transition time frame for our company will be 3 to 5 years. And in 6 months, we will make a meeting. You actually schedule the meeting right then. For 6 months from now, you schedule the meeting and say, revisit the operating assumption that the enterprise will be doing X, Y, and Z. Once you tell that to the team, it's really powerful as well, because then everyone becomes a sensor for you. If you tell the team, hey, our operating assumption is this, if you see any signals out there that are strong enough to let us know we might be off track, let's surface it, right, to do it. So hopefully that adds like how you would address making it safer.
That's great. And thank you, Sergey, for the question. Just a quick one from Emer. Can John design templates for Miro, please? Or maybe my extended question to that is the one you shared. Is that available?
I'm still trying to figure out, if someone from Miro is watching, like, there's 2 things you need to figure out, like, for my enterprise plan, like, how do I make them copyable? And then there's a thing called Miroverse. And like the metaverse, I'm just sort of scared of it, because once you use the word verse, I just imagine, getting lost in a virtual world of templates. So yeah, you could reach out to me. I could try to share this with you, or you could create a board and I could copy my board into your board. Is pretty much my method.
Absolutely. Yeah. The metaverse does sound a little bit sci-fi to me as well. So
yeah, the
that's scary.
Miroverse, it's not even meta. Yeah. I mean, it's all.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, related question. Thanks, Margaret. Do you do workshops on how to design awesome Miro boards?
Oh, geez. Maybe that's a whole new, yeah, no, I don't, because it's not part of my day job exactly at Amplitude. But yeah, contact Miro and say maybe I could be like a guest designer. That would be a good promotion.
There's a new vertical for you there, John, by the sounds of it. Okay, are there any signals you generally look out for to know that a team is asking questions at the right level?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So what you start to notice, you notice this weird cracking in the conversation. And I was just doing a workshop this morning, so I could see it, where it's like there's questions coming and there's a faint signal in someone's eyes. I know this sounds weird, but like usually, and sort of like, the example this morning, it was this very patient, totally scanning engineer watching the whole thing. And then they dropped a little thing, basically like, that's not within our control. And then the PM shut it down pretty quickly. The PM was basically like, the PM wanted it to be within their control and or wanted it to be known. So I look for those little signals. That sounds like a negative signal to look for. But where you're looking at is for just the slightest crack that could extend it into another way. So what the engineer wanted was to just get down more within their control. They wanted to move the question asking down. And so we dipped down in there. And then ironically, the engineer realized why the PM's view might be valuable, and they kind of spun back up to a higher level to do it. But we needed to go down there for the engineer to feel comfortable with that direction. So hopefully that gives an example. Like, you're just imagining the conversation as a flow of a river, and you just start to see some rocks there and interesting kind of things. And I don't even know how to describe it. It's just something you start to notice, and Zoom makes it a lot harder, of course, to do it. So
yeah, absolutely. So thank you for the question. We have time, I think, for one more question. Just last one I see here. Do you see relationship between teams skipping past divergence and teams feeling they're working in feature factories?
Oh, totally. Yeah, the premature convergence, you could draw a terrible diagram around high work in progress, premature convergence, incentive structures around shipping. Sunk cost bias just goes way through the roof when you don't really diverge and you just kind of rush into solutioning. And the same thing goes with the questions. You just don't ask great questions. They're all very evaluative questions. They're like, is this the right thing? And you do that. So I think that it's something that PM, I tell you, the problem is that PMs and some other, like maybe just the PM designer, go off and do it in another room. They've diverged for months. They come down, they say to the team, they're like, this is what we're going to do. And the team has no knowledge of all the crazy diagram that they went. The PM says, well, this is what we're going to do. And then like 2 seconds later, whole thing explodes. It takes a month or two just to kind of realign the people with they just re-explore it. How many times that's happened to me, So, and that's in environments where I was allowed to let it happen. If you aren't really allowed to let it happen, forget about it. You're just gonna march forward on doing that. So
Yeah. I always find that's a bit of a false economy. We're saving time up here, but then there's that kind of payoff to get people on the same page later
one thing
on.
to think about is some executives and certainly people actually think they're doing you a favor to give you something more prescriptive.
Right.
How many, environments that are like, oh, they're a great spec writer. And you hear this even from engineers. Like, someone told me once, like, John writes the best specs ever. And this was about 15, 18 years ago. That project failed so badly that whenever my friend says that again, now 18 years later, I'm like, Bruce, that has gone like way out of style. Don't say that. Like, don't let anyone know I can write a good spec. Otherwise, I'll be in trouble here. So,
absolutely. So, John, I think we could probably ask questions for a while longer, but we're just out of time.
cool.
Listen, thanks so much again for the excellent talk. And yeah, potential side business in Miro board design as well. By the sounds of it.
I'll do a workshop at the next event, like in the side stage around the Miro
Yeah,
workshop.
exactly. Yeah,
Basically, you need to be
listen,
able to do them at 5:30 a.m. this morning, and then if the board lasts 10 workshops after doing them at 5:30 a.m., you've got the design down. So
absolutely.
cool.
Just where can people find out more about you if they haven't come across your work before?
Yeah, so you could email me, john.cutler@amplitude.com. If you work in a sort of big company and you could pretend or even not pretend you might be interested in product analytics, I could probably come and do a workshop at your company, which is a cool part of my role, or do a talk. So that could be a fun way to collaborate. You can sort of get in touch about that, and Twitter as well, because I'm addicted to Twitter. I mean, that's like, I have to just admit that. I'm just coming clean. Like, that is definitely been a positive addiction in my life. So.
I'd be surprised if the majority of our audience haven't come across it on Twitter. Definitely recommend following John on Twitter, and also on his blog and The Beautiful Mess. It's really good reading. John, listen, we'll leave it there, and we hope to see you in Dublin again soon.
Yeah,
Albeit when it
something.
good in the near future.
Yeah, this time I'll bring the 3-year-old. I remember. Yeah, the last time. Anyway, cool. All right.
Absolutely.
Okay. Hope everyone having a great event. Okay. Talk to you soon.
Thanks. Take care.